welcome everyone. It's a great honor that everyone has come to listen to me today. And I'm going to spend some time charting my research across decades, continents, and disciplines where I've carved a world-leading path, weaving in and out of academia, as Todd has said. But I want to start by stepping back in time. So I come from a lineage of strong, resilient women. And the woman on the far left came from the Ukraine to Canada by herself at age 16. And she forged a new life and a family, and some of whom are in this room who've made the travels to come and be here today. And I'm surrounded also by strong, resilient women in my day-to-day life. And this has put me in extremely good stead, especially in a very male field of coastal geoscience and engineering. And so as a woman in science, I really want to thank all my great mentors, colleagues, and my students, and to Tim Baxter especially, because he showed me this wall of women in Oxford. He said, well, you're on the wall. I said, well, I didn't know I was on the wall. I submitted something before COVID. I didn't remember. And I was really touched to find myself on this wall of women that was done to kind of counter the maleness of all the men on this wall. So I've been a beneficiary of programs to reduce the gender gap in science and engineering, including a doctoral grant from the Government of Canada, which really, I wouldn't be where I am today without these things. There's still much to be done for women in science and engineering, juggling careers and caring commitments. And so I decided to chart the course of my career alongside life events and caring commitments to hopefully provide some inspiration. And so there was too many women around the world who sent me photos. So here's a sample of my field work colleagues from around the world, other influential women in geomorphology who have inspired me over the years. And so where has my research work taken me? It's taken me from the forests of Canada. I got to work in 9 of 13 biogeoclimatic zones as an undergraduate. And then I went over to the UK, and then I worked around the world. And I've had a great opportunity and pleasure of working in multiple countries with experiencing their cultures and hosting students from around the world. And everyone kindly filled in a form for me. It was for good reason. There's people participating online. There's over 80 people signed up to listening online live. Plus there's about 40 or 50 people who have signed up for pre-recordings, as well as all of you in this room. And Mike Shand kindly made this map today. And these are the people that have come from the UK. And I know there's a few that got snarled up in the train cancellations, so they're now live online as well. But I really need to thank everyone from all these parts of my personal and professional life for taking the time to be here today. And this is a conventional academic path. You may do an undergraduate, a master's, a PhD, you might do a series of postdocs and then go on and become a professor. I didn't do that. I had a dual career challenge, but I had a series of life events and threw obstacles along the way early in my career. So I in turn turned challenge into opportunity, and my career path really looks much more like a paper airplane. And so core to this has always been interdisciplinarity, working across disciplines and divides of disciplines. But I've danced in and out of academia, and in doing so, I've gained a really important skill set of how to talk and work with people from all walks of life and all fields, from being in a logging camp with loggers cutting down trees to being on a construction site with contractors building an engineering scheme. These experiences have been fundamental to shaping my path and bridging this academic practice divide. It's also made preparing this talk today rather challenging because I don't have that linear route. So hopefully you'll be able to follow that today. So as an outline, I'm going to talk a little bit about my early motivation to do what I do and why does this work matter. And then I'm going to give you some glimpses of research and practice, and it's going to have 2 themes that I run through of my work, and then there's some more appreciation at the end. And so what drove me to study geography? Well, I grew up in the late 1980s, early 1990s in Vancouver, where Greenpeace was founded. And so we have acid rain was happening at the time in eastern Canada. We had the start of rainforest destruction in the Amazon. I lived rainforest destruction in British Columbia. There was the ozone hole, and there was waste management starting to rear its head. These problematics were going on around me, and there was a burning question. Why are we, evidently, so continuously driven to destroy our own habitat? So I set on a career path to try to address this, and one where I could work to make positive changes in science policy and practice. And I had seen as a teenager some of the things that were starting to happen in terms of legislation, in terms of science, in terms of being on committees. And so I decided to study geography even before many governments and politicians were really talking about it honestly. And by 2002, these environmental concerns were really at the fore of people's minds. And Michael Palin has said so many of the world's current issues at a global scale and locally boil down to geography, and we need geographers of the future to help us understand them. These issues are more pressing now than they were then. So why did I leave Canada to come to the UK? And so I did a lot of work. I did a cooperative education degree, which was a phenomenal experience. I did 16 months of work experience alongside my degree in research, in practice, in government and industry, in forestry. And I've worked with people who said, I don't need to understand plants to know how this forest is working. I don't need to understand the biology to know how the soil is working for. And I was really frustrated because I could see the interactions, and there was starting to be literature about the interactions. So I left Canada, and I swapped that for the virgin rainforest of Canada for this Welsh grey, rainy coast. But I turned this idea of turning a frustration of seeing the interactions, but people weren't interested in studying it at the time, into this lifelong career. And so going from this siloed thinking into bridging between two disciplines. So I started a PhD in rock coast biogeomorphology, and I went to work with Heather Viles, who had written the book about biogeomorphology. And so although the Welsh coast was strikingly different from Western Canada, rock coasts were my happy place as a child. I had the privilege of spending time on the Gulf Islands, and they're an amazing place, even more amazing than Vancouver. And so that I was going to be a female scientist, working with an amazing female scientist, working in a landscape that I felt really comfortable in, even though it was halfway around the world. And so what I asked was really, how do rocks and biology interact to shape the shore? And these interactions between life and the landscape. And so what a biogeomorphological approach allows us to do is ask different questions than an ecologist would ask or a process scientist would ask without putting the two disciplines together. And so we started to look at putting out some samples of rock onto the beach, and we asked different questions. We asked, what is the role of biology in shaping the rocks, and how does the rocks shape the biology? And as you'll see here, you have rocks that have been bored by animals and rocks that haven't. So and at a microscopic scale, they turn the rock from a solid rock into an arrow bar from a dairy milk bar. And so I use chocolate as an analogy a lot of the time. But that work, although it was on a rocky coast, I actually made some significant contributions to the discipline as a whole. And I identified that some species could protect the rock rather than just eat the rock and erode the rock. And I identified that these processes were affected disturbance, and they were complex. And we talked about some of those complexities. And so there was a series of seminal papers that came out of that work, one of which was that I was invited to participate in this workshop where I really learned, what was exciting, is I like to work on diagrams. And Heather Viles, who's listening in, she used to say, I feel a diagram coming on. And her and I, so my role with this room full of very eminent male scientists was to help stitch together and do these diagrams for this paper. And that's often my contribution to a paper, is linking things together. So I finished that work, and I then went to the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research. So I went from studying two sciences to really becoming interdisciplinary. And the Tyndall Centre was one of the first global centres. It still exists today on addressing climate change in an interdisciplinary way. It was exciting, it was enriching, it was thought-provoking. I got to work with some of the world leaders on climate change in the UK, including Mike Hume, Robert Nichols, Tim O'Riordan, Emma Tompkins, Neil Adger, Sir Urs Desai, among many. And we were trying to put together a whole range of disciplines, economics, engineering, geomorphology, human geography, and ecology, to look in a place and say, how vulnerable is it and how do we respond to climate change? And the work was very interesting, but it was 5 hours away from Simon. And I decided that I needed to not be so far away. And so I left and I went into environmental consultancy for a year. And I went and worked with environmental impact assessments that are also broad and interdisciplinary, but you had to follow the protocols and you couldn't change them and they were quite rigid. And I thought, I don't want a career doing that. And so I went to the Environment Agency, so I'd still stayed in Bristol, and we went and I started to shape policy and help implement policy and advise central government. And what you see here is that the policies had increased enormously, environmental policies had increased, but they were siloed. And at the time I worked in the environment industry, integrated legislation had come into be, the Water Framework Directive. And I was brought in with my interdisciplinary hat to help bring the scientists who weren't used to working together on topics to really see the catchment and understand how they were going to work together. And it's where, as Todd said, I helped set up the Marine Climate Change Impacts Partnership. And so then, but over those intervening years, so that was about six years from finishing, doing my PhD, through all of this work, all these wonderful things happened. That's the top part. There's Simon looking like Hugh Grant for weddings at the funeral, through to us getting married, to me graduating, to getting my British citizenship. And I often joke that I came and people say, why are you still in this country? And I said, well, I got more certificates than I bargained for. And that's the ladders at that time. But the snakes of that time were that I had a lot going on in my life. Instead of 4 weddings and a funeral, going back to Hugh Grant, I was dealt a hand of cards of 1 wedding and 6 funerals. 6 members of my immediate family had died in that window of time. And Simon, you were my anchor through that tumultuous time and have been ever since, along with friends and family who are in this room today. So I'm so grateful to those who've helped me celebrate those periods of my life, because that really affected my career path as well. And I can't thank everyone enough, because it really does take a village to thrive. And so we returned to academia, but I returned to academia and I was not classed as a lecturer. I had 3 contracts and a small amount of research time, but I wasn't allowed to apply for Research Council funding. So between 2007 and 2013, I wasn't able to apply for Research Council funding. So I had to do non-standard approaches to rebuild my research career. And so I had to be inventive, and so one of the funds that I got was from the Esby Fairbairn Foundation here, and a PhD studentship, which was Martin Coombs. And what we did is we got a piece of research work, but we also did this outreach guide called Shore Shapers. And we created awareness of these interconnections, because rocky shores, people don't talk about these sorts of things. They don't learn about how do the animals sculpt the shore. And that was at the time that Tristan was born, the idea was conceived, and by the time Shore Shapers came out and it featured in National Geographic Kids, Cameron was born. And so I then ended up doing a period of work on nature-based solutions and helped bringing into the urban coasts. So we're increasing urban populations worldwide. There's increased need to manage flood and erosion risks, and there's a decline of urban ecology. So these growing pressures, could they create an opportunity for my subject? So that's what relates to what's in front of you in the room. So these blocks were what Martin put out in his PhD here. But I'd identified this policy gap. So a lot of my research questions have come from practice and from gaps in practice that I do, rather than just coming from the ivory tower. And so there was a gap in policy. We got the funding. We did this PhD. We got a lot of blue sky science that came out of it. But we also turned the PhD into guidance for the Environment Agency. And that guidance turned out to be really important and pivotal, because we were then invited by a flood scheme by Mott MacDonald, because they were having trouble getting it approved. And they wanted us to come and help them around enhancing the ecology. And so so then, as part of that, it followed on. I came up to Glasgow. So now I'm in Glasgow, and after because I had to take a demotion to come to Glasgow, and again had to rebuild my research career. I wasn't eligible for regular funding until 2015, but at that point I was on maternity leave. So it took till sort of 2016, and so I won this industrial exchange with SAGES at Arup, which is a leading environmental consultancy. And I spent some time there in 2014, and we developed this terminology called greening grey infrastructure, because green infrastructure policy at the time, and even now, doesn't talk about greening very many non-building assets that are grey. And there's a whole suite of them. There's tram lines, there's sewage outfalls, there's seawalls. And so we created this terminology, which then has led on to this tranche of work. And so what we did is then I received money finally from the Research Council as a PI, and I created the first UK synthesis of these measures across the landscape, and created this evidence-based directory of case studies. And that has been really influential because it's enabled me to, it's led on to some applied things, which you'll see as I move through the talk, but it's also, the US Corps of Army Engineers led on international guidelines on this topic, and there was not a chapter on greening the grey. They had ignored it, and they decided on the back of the UK work to add a chapter to international guidelines, which I was then allowed to co-author. And so this work has changed policies, produced guidelines, but there was also few products available. You couldn't, even if you wanted to adopt green grey in the coast, in Scotland or in the UK, you couldn't build it very easily. And there's a bunch of startups now working on this, but what we did is we went back to the science and we applied biogeomorphology on materials used in coastal defences. And so we looked at the materials that are commonly used, including concrete, which is here, and we then looked at how does the biology and the physical response of these things interact. And so we scaled my research through time, which is why these are here today. So this was Martin's PhD, and this was Mari's PhD that's in the room. This is funding from Nature's Scott Biodiversity Challenge Fund that were put out in COVID, you'll hear about in a minute. And we're now, as you'll see, as we go on, we're scaling even bigger. So we scaled this research through time. And we also tried to do biomimicry, where we've mimicked natural rocky biomimicry there. They look like barnacles, designed to attract barnacles. And here, we scanned the rock surface and we tried to replicate natural rocky shore. And this was, I also need to thank the university because they gave academic returners fund money for people returning from maternity leave, and this is what paid for these, which then supported Mari's PhD. Okay. And so we have, what we've done with this, which is quite incredible, it was probably a kind of blew me in my mind when I first saw it, is that we went from this scale of material here to the design. We helped advise on the design of 2 kilometers of seawall when it's been built in Portsmouth in a £20 million flood state. So we've gone from a little block all the way up to an enormous seawall. And I was quite blown away when I first saw it, and it's really exciting. And that Lucy Sheffield needs to be thanked because all of these projects have required a really influential, really enthusiastic person because it's about innovating. When we had the first meeting, Dale, who's in the room, can attest, the contractor said, we can't build this. We had the meeting, we came out of the meeting, and they said, we can build it for a price. And so a lot of it is changing how people think and changing how people work in order to implement some of these things. So our approach with this has, one of the things I wanted to do is we've got a second sort of design, which is really about bringing those biogeomorphology, because there's ecologists that talk about the extinction of experience, the decline of urban ecology. We don't, they're ecological deserts. And how do we bring back nature into cities, but how do we bring back the sense of nature to people in cities? And so what we did is we've designed this, and we started with this block. This block was made with the full-scale design in mind. And so what we've done is we tested this, and Alejandra, who's in the room, I think in the room, she helped me with this experiment, and we set these up. And the first lot went in before COVID, first lockdown, literally the week before the first lockdown. Oh no, as the experiment failed. And then actually what happened is there was a gap of time and we managed to put them out. It was the first thing the contractors could do after COVID lifted because it was outside. We got the second set in. And so this experiment was disrupted, but actually we turned that into an opportunity because we've now published about the timing of deployment doesn't affect how the things colonize after a couple of years, which was really nice outcome. But in the middle of all this, we had to homeschool. And it was quite involved, and it was quite crazy. But we managed. But what we did is we gave ourselves time outside the house by sharing around the children in all weathers, which kept us a little bit more sane. And so what we've done with this is we now have gone from this scale to a full wall design and a block. And I've spent much of the last year working with our commercialization team at the university, and I can actually announce today that the terms have now finally been agreed, the legal documents are being drafted, and this will be available for them to use in flood schemes. And there's 3 large test blocks that are out down in the southeast of England. So the goal of this was met, which is really nice. And so that's the nature-based path. So now I'm going to move on to the coastal climate change path. And so we need to learn to live with how our planet is changing. And so one of the things is you need to think about your children, your grandchildren, in 2 or 3 generations. Because this sea level rise curve only goes to 2100. And I know a lot of the 7-year-olds in the room don't look like that. But if a baby born in 2015 will probably experience up to a meter of sea level rise in their lifetime. Just put it in context, we've only had 20 centimeters of sea level rise in the last century. So we're going to have a rapid amplification of sea level rise. So if you go back to think about your children and grandchildren, we're now finally starting to map sea level rise to 2300, to predict it to 2300, only in the last couple of years. And it could be the height of a double-decker bus if we don't hit net zero. So how high and how fast it goes depends on our actions as humans. And the other thing is that there's a lag effect. So even if we were to reach net zero tomorrow, sea level will continue to rise, and it will continue to rise for centuries. So we're going to be living with what we've already done for quite a long time into the future. So this means we have to adapt, and we have to think quite differently about how we live at the coast. And so this cartoon is actually a Canadian cartoonist, and he, you may have seen it. It went viral. It was released just before the first lockdown of COVID. But it's absolutely correct that what we experienced in COVID is much smaller than the kind of changes that we're going to expect in the lifetime of all the children in this group. And Iris Moeller, who's a professor at Trinity College Dublin, has said we need these interdisciplinary disciplines because it's going to take all of us to make changes together. And so really what we need to do is adapt our mindset from a coastline to a dynamic coast. And instead of using those walls that I've just designed, we've got products where we need walls in some places. But in the large parts of the world, that will not be feasible or possible. So we need to think about how we're going to adapt how we live. And so I've spent a lot of the last 10, 15 years working on this as well. And there's some planners that have some great quotes about rethinking the shoreline edge in these dynamic ways. And adaptation is this process by which society adapts to this dynamic and changing coast. So if there's one thing you take from this lecture, and I obviously didn't hit home enough with my course that I just taught, because I've just finished marking the exams and they still wrote coastline. And the coast has always been dynamic. All around Scotland, all around the UK, in other parts of the world, there's raised beaches, and those raised beaches are 10 meters above current sea level. At some time in the past, it was warmer and sea level was that high. We're talking about a double-decker bus of height by 2300. Are we building homes in places now that will last till 22? We need to really be thinking about that. And so this is work that we've been doing at Edinburgh, and this was all reclaimed. So if you follow this along, a lot of this land was reclaimed. So we took land from the sea, and we now probably are going to have to let it go back. And so I went back, because I was going back in time as I go through this. So I was at Exeter now, and I was trying to rebuild my research career. And I went back to rocky coasts, and because rocky coasts are seen as being not vulnerable. They're seen as being hard. And they were also something that I could rebuild my research career with. And they make up about 80% of the world's shore. And there's a lot of preconceived ideas about these. And so I spent a long time challenging preconceived ideas. So this is the National Monitoring Programme in England, and it basically says they change slowly. And so frequent monitoring will not show significant changes. Erosion does occur with time, but the low rate of change does not require monitoring. There's hardly any airflow that was going back from the 1940s that were at low tide sufficiently to measure the change. And the USGS, which is the American Geological Service, created this coastal vulnerability index, and they say these have low risk, low vulnerability. And we have little reliable data on these systems. And so what we did is we spent some time working on these shores, the same shore that I'd worked on for the biology. But as you can see, it's all dimpled, the rock, and there's joints running through it. And the theory was that the rocks grind down slowly. And that's how people measured erosion. so they were thinking about this, somebody licking a dairy milk bar rather than a Toblerone bar in pieces coming off. And that's really what was happening. And so we produced a paper around this, that the shores were geologically contingent. So it mattered whether there was joints and blocks and how quickly it was coming off. But more importantly, we were measuring that, and I went out and I was measuring in a storm in 2008. And James Mendelsohn needs a big thank you, as well as Wayne Stevenson for a lot of this work. But we actually had to paint them because they were changing so quickly, and they got piled up that you couldn't have monitored them any other way. But we actually found that they were moving. And they moved overnight. So this is a number of boulders that moved overnight during a storm. So you're getting 25, 30 boulders moving. Bearing in mind, the literature said, this is only tsunami can move these boulders. And so this is really, we changed the field because we said they can change often. We were at a conference where we met a beach scientist who had written textbooks in America, Norb Sitzi, and he said, "You study rock coasts?" He said, "I pity you." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because they don't change." And I said, and I had just come from doing this work, and I said to him, "Well, what's change mean to you?" He said, "Oh, changing meters and days." Well, our rocks have moved 60 meters, and they've ripped from the bedrock in that time. They've changed a lot. And then we finally, technology caught up with those old photographs. In Wales, at least, there was a really better photo record, and we could actually look at change through time. And Danielle Buchanan came in with Martin Hurst, who also needs a big thank you, this work where we actually could quantify the change. But what we showed is that it eroded quickly and on human timescales. And this was important because we showed they were more vulnerable than we previously thought. And what we did is, before it was published academically, scientifically, I worked with an artist, and we looked at how to share coastal change, and we published a paper looking at how we can look at storms and changing mindsets through art, which was really powerful experience. But more importantly, what this work did is that in the IPCC, they only talked about, was Rocky Shores, they only talked about ecology. They talked about the ecology having to move because of changes in sea surface temperature. But they didn't talk about rocky coasts. And so we managed to get in that they are more vulnerable, because once they erode, you can't glue them back. We can't build a seawall for them. And so it was a really big impact in terms of that work, but it also then led me to lead this with a bunch of other senior, very eminent scientists. So Tom Spencer, Stuart Lane, Steve Darby, and Amira Smoller, for example, to look at geomorphology. Wasn't the landscape change, the dynamics of the landscape were not in the cracks. We were having big storms and floods. It was ecology. It was what was happening to the beavers, how the beavers could improve things. Well, that's biogeomorphology. So what we did is we created this international initiative to raise the profile of geomorphology in response to storms. And for example, some rivers have actually broken their banks from flooding, and they're going to get more of that with climate change. So it was the Indus River, and the river was going like this, and the water was so high that it just pushed the banks through. And we're going to get that kind of disruptive change in our landscape as our climate change takes pace. And even this winter at Montrose, we've had about 12 meters of loss behind coastal banks. So we're starting to get these big changes. So we need to make space for landscape change. We need to understand it. We need to make future smart, intergenerationally flexible decisions. So the choices the scientist makes at present, such as planning, infrastructure, and engineering decisions, will have a strong bearing on how much physical space is left for the coast to adapt. Because as sea level rises, the beach is going to want to move inland. And it's exactly what's happening here in this picture. That was a brand new car park that was built after the previous storm. The landowner did not want to give their land to put the car park somewhere else and shuttle bus people to the car park. That's what needs to change. And so, fortunately, I was asked to get involved with Professor Katrina Brown on a Belmont Forum-funded project where I was a scientist amongst social scientists and other people, and we were looking at how do people perceive risk, and how does risk change, and how does that affect our decision-making. And during this project, the 2013-14 storms happened in the UK, which were very pivotal storms. The railway was closed for 3 months at Dawlish, so you couldn't get to the southwest of England, for example. And what we did is we said, how do we start to think about using those storms as catalysts to be proactive about how we adapt? Can we have our plans in place first? So one place in Cornwall, that it was already agreed that the road would be moved if it was washed out, but they hadn't put all the plans in place to do that. So the road just got rebuilt. And it was not helpful that David Cameron stood up and said, we will rebuild. Because it undermined all the local authorities and the Environment Agency to take the different decision. We need to rebuild resiliently and differently, and that does not mean in the same place. And that's really, really important. And so that's some of the ideas that came out of this, but also that we look at event-based thresholds. So we say, when we get a big storm, we'll take a different path. And fortunately in Scotland, the climate change adaptation plans are starting to do that. They're starting to look at event-based systems. And so this led me on to get back at Glasgow now, to get a knowledge exchange fellowship, because I finally had the contract where I could get Research Council funding, but also because I had the MAGIC project, I was able to apply for it. And this is another point of women in science. I have to really thank Maggie Cusack, who was head of school at the time, because I was told I was ineligible to apply to the funding because I was having a baby and the project wasn't going to start on the time to. Unfortunately, the Research Councils have put new policy in place, and we challenged it, and I was allowed to apply out of sync. And they considered my application, and then they allowed me to have the fellowship. And so it was really, really important that we were challenging things, because that was not a pleasant situation to be in. But what I decided to do with this fellowship was to spend time with local authorities to think about how do we make those decisions? How do we move that road that I described earlier? And what types of ecosystem-based approaches to bringing in my other strand of research can we start to think about in urban places, including Glasgow and Edinburgh, and to sort of provide a route map or a way of helping practitioners. And so what we did is we spent some time, and Jim Hansen needs a huge thank you here as well, is that we worked with the city of Edinburgh, and the Edinburgh Adapts had been through its entire process of consultation by the time we were asked to get involved. And just as a show of hands, how many people think of Edinburgh as being by the sea? So 34% of its political boundary is the coast, and basically they didn't have a single action about the coast. So we basically added you in and said we need to think about this. We need to strike evidence, which we've done, but we also need to engage people to talk about how do we adapt our urban footprint to accommodate this dynamic coast. And so one of the things that I've been privileged to work on since I've been in Scotland is the Dynamic Coast Project, which Alistair Rennie and Jim Hansen were at the helm of for the Scottish Government, and that covers soft coasts really, really well in Scotland. It's an incredibly valuable piece of resource for helping plan coastal change. But on more urban coasts, that method didn't work particularly well because there's been sea walls the whole time. We've reclaimed this land that's an area you saw earlier. We've reclaimed this land, so we can't move it. It doesn't look like it's changed. Just because there's no evidence of erosion between 1890 and 2010 doesn't mean there's no risk. It just means we've defended it the whole time. So what we did is we looked at some old maps. We looked at land use in land use history. We looked at flood risk, and we produced some scenarios, some semi-quantitative scenarios of what might be alternate places to align the coast with time. And we use these data to support a planning decision. So this is the same slide, just looking at a different angle. But this is an engineering diagram from AECOM, who is a consultant. And if they were to build houses there, they'd have to build the wall to the height of my student. And that was just sea level rise to 2100. That's not a double-decker bus. And so what we did is we managed to provide some additional evidence. So all these little ribbons of lines were our lines to say not only is there high flood risk, but there's also high erosion risk. We also brought in an environmental economist with COVID recovery money, and we did an economic valuation of the coastal park versus developing houses and the benefits and disbenefits. And we basically helped support the local authority in getting the original master plan, which was houses towards the edge, to help get this park through. And so it's really exciting because the park has been approved. And there's light industrial units there, so they're actually planning a retreat of that light industrial units. They're going to make a park. And what that's going to do is create a buffer for future generation. It's going to be green space at the moment, when it's built, by 2030, and then by 2050, or 2080, 2090, some point in the future, it will become the coast. And so, again, COVID disrupts this work. And there's lots of people sitting in the room who are in these photos who kept us sane during this time. And also some young visitors was my very first visitor to the house after that COVID lifted. And it is a challenging time, again, because of the homeschooling and juggling. But Jamie Toney is to be thanked because she spearheaded this large bid for the Gallant program during that second lockdown. And our group had two of us on part-time furlough for childcare, one with a one-year-old baby. It was chaos. And so we managed by hook or crook to get our work package into this bid, which has been funded. And what we're doing now is we're bringing together that nature-based strand of my work with the kind of coastal adaptation work and starting to say, well, where might it be suitable? And at what scale do we need to plan flood risk across the city? And we're bringing a lawyer and social scientists. We have a new postdoc starting on Monday that will be working on how do we implement it. So once we decide where we put it, how do we implement it? How do we make the changes that are needed to support planning authorities to make decisions to change what we do on land in make space for water? And this is guided by stakeholders as well in terms of what types of natural features we will put in. And so, a little while longer, COP26 came to our city. And COP really it was a wonderful experience for us, lots of us that were in the city. Children got to experience a lot of wonderful things. But I did a lot of media work during that time. And New Scientist had picked up on my 2-minute video that some of you may have watched. And they ended up calling me Proto-Greta, which is tiny, strange. But actually, a year later, I was picked up by my French 24 News. And being Canadian, I had to take French to grade 12. I had to read French in my PhD. I examined 2 PhDs in French. And then I was picked up for the World Bank because I had the language skills and I had the science skills. And they asked me to advise on this climate change project in West Africa. And it was incredibly exciting and rare opportunity. And so I went to Togo, to West Africa, in November of 2022. And it brought back my environmental consultancy days because I had to go back to environmental impact assessments because that's how they assess the project. So it was really nice to come full circle. And those skills were very, very valuable. And unfortunately, the EIA legislation has not changed a lot. We had to discuss. And so what we did is there was a complaint by the community about the projects, but really I got to see what is coming in terms of coastal climate change firsthand. Because these communities along this coast have had a very modest amount of sea level rise, but a high amount of human impacts through infrastructure. So there's a dam in Ghana, there's a port in the north of Togo that has cut off the sediment supply. And so you've got the erosion happening up to 10 meters a year. I was walking on the beach and there was former wells, and one of the wells was built in 1969, 5 years before I was born. And so it was like walking through, archaeological relics of buildings that were just crumbling into the sea. And we'd walk with the locals and say, that's where my house used to be. And this is now, before sea level rise really takes effect. But the legislation that they were working to was dated from, the project was pre-2018, so that basically they didn't have to consider future climate change very much because the project was approved on the legislation because it was approved of. And so, but the nice thing that happened was that I managed to kind of spend some time with the World Bank's inspection panel team, and they actually came round to the idea of the climate change being really important, and I got to produce a technical annex. So out of the 40 inspections that have had world external experts in the 30 years of the inspection panel, only a handful have ever had technical annexes. So it was a real honor to be asked to write it, and to be asked to write it for West Africa as the region. And I also managed to say I needed some budget for graphics, because I spend a lot of time on visuals, and visual communication is very important. And so this Barrier Island is a very narrow, it's like this table. The Barrier Island is like this table. There's a beam and there's the land. It's 5 meters above sea level average height. They've rebuilt the national highway for the third time, because the other two have already fallen into the sea. 28% of the population lives there, 70% of their GDP comes from there. I was walking along the edge mapping, and it was falling into the sea. My weight is very, very fragile place. And so we need so then what I did is I managed to get approval for these diagrams to be produced. And even in the IPCC, the adaptation diagrams are typically disconnected from the sea level rise. So the risk is disconnected from what we need to do about it, because I think the assumption is people know. And so I put the two things together, and that diagram, the top diagram, was actually taken by the inspection panel team to the community to help explain a report and explain how climate change is working for them. And there's now a summary video, and they talk about the role of these diagrams and the power of them for helping people understand what's coming. But what we also did is had these diagrams made where they were managing the beach rather than thinking about the barrier, because they didn't have to think long-term trust, because the project was really to put grains and coastal protection in for 30 or 40 years. And what they did is so we started to lead this. So we said, well, this is at the beach resorts now, and this, as you go through 1 meter, 3 meters of sea level rise, the barrier might disappear completely. And to connect, what is the landscape going to do to help us better understand how we can make defenses in that spectrum? And so I know there's a lot of stress about immigration, for example. There's going to be migrants. There's going to be lots of migrants. There's going to be migrants in this country. And so it's really a great experience to be able to do this and to see that these visuals and this science is being taken forward and shared in a way that's accessible to people. And hopefully that will foster different decisions being taken. And so I'm going to end on a couple more visuals. So I had the pleasure and the privilege of going, Professor Susan Waldron invited me to run a knowledge exchange work package on a completely different landscape. This was the poorest region of the poorest province of China. I had to go to China when Cameron was 2, and Keith and Liz are to be thanked for repeatedly coming up and helping with the children. Well, I've been away doing things in far-flung places, and it certainly gave me a lot more security and able to be away, knowing that they were there. But here you had a diagram that's used widely that explains this thing called the critical zone, but really it's the zone that we live in and breathe in that we affect most critically. And the diagram was completely in the natural world. All the science was done completely in the natural world. But the system is actually heavily human modified. But nobody had drawn it, nobody had really talked about it. And the scientific results were affected by that land use. And so we produced this new diagram to represent and visualize. And so there's a huge thank you to Jenny, who's in the room, who helped me learn to write again after COVID, and Tim and Paul for their unwavering support through this COVID time of blindness. And then the second thing we did with this is we spent some time looking at its different social capital. So we looked at how people were interacting in these different regions of China that we were working in. We could see that there were strong family bonds in one region, but another region was much more willing to accept local authority to specialist knowledge. And what we did with that is, again, talk about, well, this whole project was designed for sustainable development goals, but the scientific questions were set here. or in meetings with the Chinese scholars. They weren't set in the community. And so what we did is we said, actually, the community needs to know. We asked, are they interested in learning? What are barriers to learning about sustainable farming practices? And so what we did is we created a blueprint for a new funding model that talks about the need to actually do the social pricing and the geography first, to go into the environment, ask them what do they need if they really want to be serious about delivering sustainable development goals, so that we can design the science to best meet local needs quickly. Because these people were the biggest cost was fertilizers. There was too much nitrogen in the soil. So they were adding more nitrogen than they needed to the crops, and they were hungry and were not hardly making ends meet. And so can we change how we do the research? So it's really great that the research councils over the last year have been doing many more interdisciplinary bids, cross-council funding. But this also says, so we need to change the order with which we do things. Do we need some things to come first and then other things to come second, to really design our studies so that we're making the best chance of improving things for everyone in the planet. And so hopefully I've demonstrated to you how geography is core to these combined biodiversity, planetary and climate emergencies from the little lens of my research. The planet is not in good health. It's deteriorated across my lifetime. And so human activities in response to these crises in the next 2 decades, the IPCC and others say, will determine the livability of our planet for humans and non-humans. So we all need to work together. We all need to do our part to help live well with this dynamic landscape in our changing climate. And this requires us to be sea level wise and to act now to live with the coastal change that we're already committed to. So these are challenging decisions, but we need to be climate smart and intergenerationally just. So we need to put future generations first. And Jamie Toney and several of us in the university just advised on Scottish Government's consultation. They're bringing in the equivalent of the Future Generations Wellbeing Act into Scotland that's alive and doing really good things in Wales, because every decision in Wales now has to think about future generations first as part of their decision making. And really, that's what we need to do. We have to live within planetary boundaries of the future so that we can have a life for the young people in this room and listening around the globe. So it's a huge thank you from everyone near and far for listening today. Hopefully you've learned a few things, and thank you. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer questions. But otherwise, thank you. Can I have a question?
Like going back to time, that was only 2 months ago, and it's not.
Sorry.
Relations that it move on.
Yeah, what's happening next? Yeah, Luke, you've got a question?
Oh, we keep finding Chris very interested, but it's really inspired what you're saying about rocky coastlines and how they're actually war at risk. Am I right in thinking that a lot of our design for coastal defences are based on rocky coasts being harboured? Let's draw a bunch of boulders in front of our coastlines. How worried should we be that they're not as resilient?
What, the rocky coast or the seawalls? Yeah, I didn't. Yeah, there's a report from the Environment Agency from 2020. There's going to be an exponential increase in the costs of maintaining and repairing our defences, and it's a major impediment moving forward, worldwide. And the EU typically use concrete, and although we're finding alternatives, so that's where this justice thing comes in, is that there will be select places where we decide that we can afford to do this moving forward, rather than doing it where we've done. So Portsmouth, where we've worked, they're because of the assets, because of all the houses, the universities, the military, the things that are there, it's getting defended. So yeah, it could just pose a challenge really for anyone else?
Can I just add something to that? So I've been looking with archaeologists and chronology because change from the past. I think it's really refreshing to hear somebody speak whose mind is very firmly set in the future, actually. I'm told to go think that in the 1920s, the famous archaeological site of Stellar Break was reinforced with concrete artificial coastlines to preserve a full-standing Neolithic village for the future. Result of that has been accelerated erosion of the sand dune to the north, which has pictish grave sites and other structures which are less favourable than the concrete barriers of Stellar Break. And I guess it's that kind of statement in the past that receives the kind of critical thinking that we've just illustrated today, I think has. Is that right as well?
Yeah. There's upstream and downstream effects.
Anything that's supposed to pass in future, I think we've shown some really interesting ideas about how to do that.
I mean, going back to the archaeology, there's someone called Hannah Fluck who's big in coastal archaeology, and she works now for National Trust. But I remember having a conversation with her saying one of the things about this whole policy implementation and how do we implement these things is a lot of our structures are not salty. A lot of the laws are not salty because they're not at the coast, but the coast is coming. And so you have to change them all, or start to think about which ones are open to the possibility of change and which ones need to be adapted. And so she gave an example of World War II pillboxes. And she said, how many of them do we need to preserve, do archaeological studies of, and how many can we, now we have wonderful virtual reality, can we bring in some of the material that they're made of into a museum, and can we have a virtual experience so that we're not necessarily taking the time to go through, we have to accelerate how quickly we can change all these procedures that are human procedures to say move a railway line or move things. Because the Edinburgh example is great. It's really proactive. Canada's doing the same thing. They're putting parks and post-industrial areas at the coast now too. But that's where there's very little development. We are going to have to move things where there is a lot of development as well.
Then CDs that
I did look still in
her and the description photograph of Julia Easton, but you're wrong. And it was another outside with like this CD kind of effect.
That was it.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I didn't take the time to look. So basically, well spotted. They're working. They're like chia pets. For those who grew up with chia pets, that's what they look like. There's this barren rock, and then these where they were literally like full of seaweed hair. But underneath there were crabs. There were other species that create shelter. And another tranche of our work has shown that the seaweeds actually can protect the asset from deterioration to keep it cool, but they can protect species underneath. So it's kind of like the icing on a Christmas cake.
The vertical one, that actually worked.
Yeah, they all worked. Yeah, they worked in different ways. So this, what didn't work about this one, so this one we called, this was made by Lynette Loke in Singapore, and we brought it over. And she let us use it, and she was involved in the paper, but this is fluid at the surface, so in a UK context, that doesn't work. All the smooth bits don't work very well.
Very natural.
Exactly. And so what we did is we took elements of this that worked from our PhD and designed it into this. And the barnacles work really well, but the other thing that we did with this is that this one has these are barnacles, and some of them are dead, because on a natural shore, an actual dead barnacle has very small habitat. So we biomimicry what was going on. But from and Daniel Metcalf is the designer who designed the barnacles, and then we brought John Peters in, who works from us, to design this with us, and we designed it so that the idea was that you could understand the form, the purpose to its form. You didn't need explanation because of adding a barnacle. So we added barnacles that would attract barnacles to convey to the public that this is nature. This is supposed to be an actual shore. So there's a lot of design thinking that's been brought in. But we also, with the big scale that's just been approved, so like the commercialization, is we designed it so that it can sugar when it's built, and it won't be jarring on the eye. So all those manufacturing things, and also it's the design, redesign, so it's a level that they're packing it and shipping it. All of these practical things have gone into the thinking behind it. So there's lots of different fields and lots of different people that are involved in all of these things.
Larissa, you mentioned about Dorish.
Yes.
That's the example as to the words.
Yes.
Then it was one. and they're obviously they're repairing that as we speak. That's the lines over again, and coral coal is cut off, for about 3 months.
Yes.
We've had a conversation in the past about what they should have done, which is with the way in that about 20 dollars. Is that going to happen with our current budget system, where the money, we'll find some money and that's down the back of the sofa, but unless different parties get together and say, right, this applies, it's
a very good, I think I'll touch on that political point first. I was talking to someone the other day, and I think, Glasgow University and Edinburgh University spearheaded this initiative called Scotland Beyond Net Zero, and we need to work across universities. We can't have competition. We need to work across government. We need to look across community groups. We all need to come together. And so, the climate change, what's going to happen in the near future in the coming decades, so great that we have to put aside just party politics and come together to really make decisions at national levels and international levels. And that creates a challenge. And so I think we all need to kind of be reflexive of that. I think they did an economic analysis for Dawlish, but one of the things is this, is in the Treasury and the Green Book, and how they discount things and they discount the environment into the future, and it's hard to predict the few costs. So I have a PhD student similar who's, I think, in the room, and she was working on that, and Nick Hanley's, eminent environmental economist that's super co-supervising, said we only think 30 to 40 years ahead. It's too uncertain after that. So the economic models with which we're making some of these decisions are not necessarily right in terms of these future damages. So I think it's about how do we take these bold decisions out, but also this big decision is if we put things in the wrong place, then we're going to have to take them away, and then that will be a cost that the future generation will have to bear. And so there's some political decisions now about which things are we going to accept. Put our hands up and say, yes, we've approved this, but it is before the climate change legislation. So that's why it's going to take us to be, we have to be willing to think a bit more broadly than we've done with the impacts. Okay. Any other? So we're heading down to the ARC for a reception.